Save your scraps for this project. I recently finished a quilt project that left me with all of these teeny tiny scraps, but they are too beautiful to throw away. So today I'm going to show you what I did with them. We will not be piecing these one at a time because that takes forever and you're more likely to make mistakes. Instead, I'll show you a tricky piecing method with interfacing that will leave you with precise, beautiful patchwork. You can use this method for any project that you want, and it's so easy that you'll be saving your tiny scraps from now on. In this video, we'll be finishing our patchwork into easy coasters. Grab your scrap bin and let's get started. First, raid your fabric stash for scraps. You can use any size scraps for this project, including really teeny tiny pieces. We are going to be making 1.5 inch squares. So small pieces, big pieces, any kind, and I like to just kind of choose a color theme. You're going to need an acrylic ruler. I like the ones that start at 0 in the corner and have an easy way to find 1.5 inch. I love my rotating cutting mat, rotary cutter, and fusible interfacing, plus a scrap of quilt batting. We're also going to use spray baste for this project, and finally you'll need a point turner or chopstick. We're going to start by cutting 1.5 inch squares from the fabrics. We need 16 of these for each coaster. If you're cutting from a really small scrap, I like to use my small square rotary cutter. And then for bigger scraps, you can cut strips 1.5 inches wide and then cut them down to smaller squares. Then cut a 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square from a larger piece of fabric. This will be the back of the coaster. Now I'm going to show you how to piece these together without piecing them individually. So grab a piece of lightweight fusible interfacing, and then we're going to put these squares down in a 4x4 grid. The sticky side of your interfacing should be face up. Place the fabric squares face up with the raw edges butting up right against each other. Now use your iron to press down carefully on the grid. We want to press these down just enough to hold them, and then we'll trim the interfacing and continue pressing. Use your rotary cutter to trim off the excess interfacing. Now head back to your iron and press down the squares again just to make sure they're all stuck on the interfacing really well. Now we're going to make our first seam, so fold the first row of squares down and press it with your iron. It should fold easily where the fabrics meet. Now we're going to sew across that fold with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you open that up, you'll see you just sewed 4 seams all at once. Repeat the process for the other horizontal seams. After you've sewn all 3 of those, we're going to press the seam allowances all to one side. Now we're going to repeat the process with the other seams. These ones will be a bit bulkier because we already have seam allowances in there, so just make sure you press it well to keep it flat. Sew across that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance going right over those other seam allowances. Repeat until you finish all of those seams. Now press those seam allowances all in one direction and then give the whole thing a good press. Now grab your scrap of quilt batting. We're going to spray baste our patchwork to the quilt batting. Make sure you press down really well and then let it dry fully. After it's dry, we're going to top stitch this coaster. I like to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the seams on the side of the fabric that has the seam allowance under it. That way it'll help keep the bulky seam allowance down and it'll just look really good. Top stitch both vertical and horizontal lines, and then we're going to trim off the extra quilt batting. Use a ruler to square up your coaster to 4.5 inches square. Now grab your backing fabric. We are going to do some stay stitching on one side of each of these squares. Stay stitching is just a regular length stitch where your seam allowance is going to be. Since we have to leave an opening in one of the sides, this stay stitching is a little trick to help you get a straight edge when we turn that fabric. Then go ahead and pin the coaster pieces together with the right sides together. Make sure the edges that have the stay stitching are on the same side. Now sew around the edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 inch opening on the side with the stay stitching. Clip the corners and trim your seam allowance and then turn right side out. Use a chopstick or point turner to push the corners out. If you still need help getting the corners to be the right shape, use a pin to gently grab that fabric inside the seam and pull it out. Now press your coaster really well and then turn the edges of the opening in. You can use that stitching to help you line up the edges perfectly. Now top stitch around the coaster 1/8 of an inch from the edges, pivoting at those corners. When you're done with that step, your coaster is finished. Thanks for sewing with me today. For more projects, click the video above.